Well, hello. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 8, still working through our unit on political behavior. Chapter 8 is about mass media and public opinion, which, given the fact that we just experienced a presidential election, we got to deal with both of those things quite a bit. So, the essential question for this chapter is, what is the place of the media and public opinion in a democracy? Obviously, not every country in the world has a democracy, and not every country in the world has a media that is not controlled by the government, although some people probably think that ours is. But if you were in a country like North Korea, the government has complete and total control over the media, whereas in the United States, we obviously have a media that is free to express whatever opinions they want for the most part. So, anyway, Chapter 8, Mass Media and Public Opinion. The formation of public opinion. If you look at the question there, which of the following factors has influenced your opinion about the government and politics the most? It listed several different things that have significant impacts on an individual's public opinion. Most notably, of course, being highlighted, your family. Whenever I take impromptu surveys in class and ask students how many of them have different political beliefs than their parents, it is very rare to have more than like 25% of a class that has different political beliefs than their family. Most of the time, it's even less than that. Because the reality is, even if you feel like your parents are the dumbest people in the world, you tend to fall in line with them politically. But there are other people who would say, you know what, my family has no impact on me politically. My beliefs don't align with theirs at all because my beliefs look a lot more similar to my friend group, or compare very closely to what I have learned about in school, which if you're learning about other people's political beliefs in school, that might be an issue in and of itself. But the family is the number one factor in terms of shaping and formulating somebody's public opinion. So how do we, shaping somebody's opinions. Measuring public opinion. How do we measure public opinion? A couple of different ways, none of which is perfect, and you'll see why. Obviously, elections are used to measure public opinion. We just had one in the United States. So you could say, well, Joe Biden won more popular votes than Donald Trump, and so that must mean that the public believes that he would make the best president. However, as we know from elections, one, not everybody votes, but two, we don't have an unlimited number of candidates to choose from. So elections are decent measures of public opinion, but they're not perfect. The media is used to measure public opinion, but as we know, the media can be biased toward different candidates, both on the right and the left. Personal contact is a great way to measure public opinion, but if you're only friends with people who believe one way, then your vision of how the country feels about a certain thing is going to be skewed. I'll use my own son as an example. He said something to me before the last presidential election about he believed that Donald Trump would become the next president. And I said, why do you feel like that? And he said, well, whenever we drive around, I pretty much only see Trump road signs. I don't see hardly any for Biden. And I had to explain to him that's because in the area where we live, most of the people support Donald Trump. So the people that he comes in contact with, the people in his local geographical area, most of them supported Donald Trump, but that doesn't mean that that's a reflection of the whole country. Interest groups are used to measure public opinion, but interest groups typically have a very strong feeling about only a few or maybe one issue, and so they are going to sway your ideas and beliefs about something really strongly in one way or the other. So, for instance, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, is going to be very pro-gun, even though only a small number of Americans are in the NRA. They're going to carry a lot of weight because they have a lot of money, and they have the ability to get their message out very loudly and clearly, and so that can influence people's opinions, the public's opinion. And then lastly, scientific polls, which we're going to talk more about on the next slide. So you guys have all probably seen public opinion poll results. This would be like, for instance, if there was a survey of the population saying, how many of you approve of the job that President Trump is doing? Or how many of you approve of or feel good about the economy right now, or things like that. And then they put it on the news. Oh, only 31% of Americans feel like Donald Trump's doing a great job right now. And it's stuff that we like to talk about. Well, how do they come up with those numbers? Well, the polling process has 5 steps. Step number 1, you've got to define the universe. In other words, the population that the poll aims to measure. So if you're if you want to know how people in Missouri feel about legalizing marijuana in Missouri, you're going to poll people in Missouri voters. You're not going to go to Iowa and take a poll on how Missouri voters feel about legalizing marijuana. So you first have to define the universe that you're actually attempting to measure. The second thing is you have to construct a sample. You can either construct a random sample, which would mean, let's stick with the Missouri voters and whether or not they want to legalize recreational marijuana as an example. If you decide that you're going to take your poll by just randomly calling a bunch of people around the state, like you're going to call 50,000 Missourians at random, believe it or not, that is actually a more accurate way to determine polling results than it is to do what we would call a quota or a representative sample. What that looks like is you deliberately choose a certain percentage of your participants in the poll based on the population. So if Missouri has if 51% of Missourians are women and 49% are men, then that would mean if you were trying to construct a representative or quota polling system, then your sample, then you would go out and find 51% of your audience would be women and 49% would be men. And you could break that down into any demographic. Let's say that 20% of Missourians are African Americans. So that would mean that you would have to go find 20 African Americans to survey. And bottom line is it's very difficult to hit quotas exactly correct whenever you're trying to construct a sample. But a random sample is the most accurate way to conduct a scientific public opinion poll. The next step, once you have constructed your sample, is to prepare valid questions without bias. This can be more difficult than you think. You've probably seen those psychological studies where they'll ask people, like a witness of a car accident, they'll say something to the effect of, estimate how fast the car was going when it slid into the other car versus how fast was the car going when it smashed into another car. And people will routinely give numbers higher in terms of miles per hour when you ask the question with the word smashed into another car than slid into another car. So you have to be very careful with the way you word questions and if you can ask them without bias. You have to determine how the poll is going to be taken. Are you going to cold call people? Is it going to be over email? Is it are you going to, yeah. And then analyze and report the findings, obviously, would be the last step in conducting a scientific public opinion poll. There are limits on polling. First of all, polls have to be relevant to the person actually being polled. Oftentimes, you'll see people asked, or maybe especially if they're cold called about things that they don't actually really know anything about or care about. And so that certainly limits the validity of the poll. It's important to remember that polls are not elections. Just because a random number of people are sampled doesn't mean that that's going to be an accurate predictor of how voters will vote. We saw that in the election of 2016 when the polls indicated that Hillary Clinton would become president of the United States, and that didn't happen. Also, we have a representative democracy and not a direct democracy, which leads to the question, should polls guide leaders or should leaders guide opinion? In other words, is it the lawmaker's job in Washington, D.C. to guide the rest of the nation with regards to how they feel, or should those leaders look at how Americans feel with regards to polling about key issues and make decisions based on what the public wants? So I don't have the right answer to that question. The mass media, this is the last component of this chapter. The mass media is any form of media that reaches a large number of people at the same time. So put a couple of examples there, some of which are becoming far more outdated. The radio, television, print media, the internet, which obviously would consist of social media, but even the influence of the mass media is limited. And put 4 examples of ways that the media is limited in its influence. For instance, there's a lot of people who don't pay any attention to the media. And so it's very difficult for them to influence somebody that doesn't pay attention to them. The second thing, when people do pay attention, they're very selective. You probably know people like this. Maybe you are guilty of being like this, but you only listen to certain types of opinions in the media. We all have very selective hearing, and oftentimes we only hear what we want to hear. I'm sure you're not guilty of that, but we oftentimes have very selective hearing. The third thing, the vast majority of mass media doesn't cover politics. Or the last thing, media that does cover politics does so superficially. There's just not that many media outlets that are dedicated to covering politics in a very objective way. Most media outlets claim to be objective. In other words, they claim that they're not choosing a side, that they're completely fair. But that is not the case for most media outlets, even if they claim to be fair. Anyway, most media doesn't cover politics, and even if it does so superficially. So that is all for Chapter 8. Nice short video for you there. We'll be back to talk about Chapter 9, interest groups, probably tomorrow.